All right, let's unpack this medical mystery. You guys have sent in a really interesting article about IgA nephropathy, IgAN for short. And we're diving deep into this up-to-date article to understand what makes this the most common form of primary glomerulonephritis in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating area of medicine.
Hmm.
Um, think about it this way. It's essentially your own immune system, the system designed to protect you, turning against your kidneys.
Oh, wow. It's like your body is fighting itself, which has got to be confusing for your system. The article mentions this protein, Gdiga1, and it's produced in places you wouldn't necessarily connect with your kidneys, like your gut and tonsils.
Right. And here's the thing that makes it even more interesting. Perfectly healthy people can have high levels of this Gd-IgA1 without any issues. So the big question is, why does it cause problems for some people and lead to IgAN?
Right. That's what we're here to figure out. And the article lays out something called the four-hit hypothesis to help explain how this all unfolds.
Yeah. It's a way of breaking down the development of IgAN into 4 key stages, like a chain reaction.
Like a domino effect. One thing leads to the next. Okay, so hit 1 is all about an overproduction of this Gd-IgA1 protein, almost like the factory making it has a glitch and just can't stop.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. But the question is, what triggers that glitch? The research is pointing to a combination of factors, including our genes, and even, believe it or not, the bacteria in our gut.
Wait, gut bacteria can affect our kidneys? That's a wild connection. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, it might seem surprising, but there's a growing body of research looking at the connection between the gut microbiome, which are all the trillions of bacteria living in our intestines, and various aspects of our health, including our kidneys. It seems these gut bacteria are in constant communication with our immune system.
So it's like they're sending messages that can influence how our immune system behaves?
Exactly. And some researchers believe that an imbalance in these gut bacteria, sometimes called dysbiosis, might be a contributing factor to the overproduction of Gd-IgA1. It's like the gut bacteria are sending the wrong signals, leading to this protein being produced in larger amounts than usual.
So hit 1, the overproduction of Gd-IgA1 could be influenced by a combination of our genes and the bacteria living in our gut. It seems like everything in our body is connected in some way.
It really is a complex system. And to add another layer of complexity, let's move on to hit 2.
Yeah, okay. So what happens in hit 2 of this four-hit hypothesis?
Well, hit 2 is when your immune system, for reasons we're still trying to fully understand, decides that Gd-IgA1 is actually a threat.
Yeah.
And starts creating antibodies against it.
So instead of recognizing this protein as a normal part of the body,
Yeah.
the immune system sees it as an enemy and attacks it.
That's essentially what's happening. It's like a case of mistaken identity at the cellular level.
Wow. And the article mentions something about a specific alanine to serine substitution in the antibodies. Is that important?
It is an intriguing detail. Think of it this way. These antibodies need to bind to the Gd-IgA1 to launch their attack, right? Well, this specific substitution in the antibodies seems to be crucial for that binding process. It's like a key fitting into a lock. Without the right shape, the antibodies can't latch on to the Gd-IgA1.
So this tiny change in the antibodies could make all the difference in whether they can attack the Gd-IgA1 or not. That's amazing.
It highlights how even small molecular changes can have significant consequences in our bodies.
So to summarize hit 2, the immune system starts creating antibodies against Gd-IgA1. And a specific substitution in these antibodies is crucial for them to bind to their target and launch an attack.
Exactly. Now imagine what happens when you have an overproduction of Gd-IgA1 and a bunch of antibodies circulating in your bloodstream, all geared up to attack it.
It sounds like a recipe for trouble. Is that where hit 3 comes in?
You got it. Hit 3 is where these antibodies and the Gd-IgA1 start bumping into each other and clumping together, forming what are called immune complexes.
So instead of having individual proteins floating around, we now have these little gangs of proteins causing a ruckus in the bloodstream.
It's a good way to visualize it. These immune complexes are circulating in your blood, and that's when things can really start to go wrong.
Okay, I'm sensing a but coming. What's the catch?
Well, these immune complexes, as they circulate, have the potential to get lodged in different parts of your body. In the case of IgAN, their destination of choice is
The kidneys. Hit 4.
precisely. The final blow in this four-hit hypothesis is when these immune complexes get stuck in the kidneys, specifically in a part called the mesangium, which is like a filtering unit. This causes inflammation and damage to the delicate structures of the kidneys.
So it's like these clumps of protein are clogging up the kidney's filtration system. No wonder it causes problems.
That's the basic idea, and the article goes into detail about how this happens, mentioning things like complement activation, which is basically like an amplifier of the immune response. It's like calling in reinforcements to fight a battle that's already causing damage.
Oh, wow. So we've got this four-hit process. First, there's an overproduction of this Gd-IgA1 protein, potentially triggered by our genes and gut bacteria. Then the immune system mistakenly sees Gd-IgA1 as a threat and creates antibodies to attack it. These antibodies and Gd-IgA1 clump together to form immune complexes. And finally, these immune complexes get stuck in the kidneys, causing inflammation and damage. It's like a domino effect of unfortunate events.
That's a great summary. But it's important to remember that this is just one part of the story. The article also talks about environmental factors that might be involved in IgAN.
So there's more to the story. This is getting really interesting. Tell me more.
You mentioned environmental factors a little while ago. Remember how the article talked about the possible link between infections and IgAN?
Yeah, it mentioned something about some people experience blood in their urine after they have like a respiratory infection. Is that a sign that something's going on with their kidneys?
Yes. It could be. It's one of those clues that researchers have picked up on, suggesting that infections might be playing a role in triggering or worsening IgAN. The article specifically mentioned a couple of usual suspects, like Staphylococcus aureus and Haemophilus parainfluenza.
So could these infections be setting off that whole chain reaction we were just talking about, starting with the overproduction of Gd-IgA1?
That's one theory. Researchers believe that these infections might disrupt the delicate balance of the immune system, leading to that initial surge in Gd-IgA1 production. It's like the infection throws a wrench in the works, and the immune system overreacts, producing more of this protein than it needs.
Okay, so infections could be one environmental trigger. What about food? The article mentioned food antigens too. Could what we eat be contributing to IgAN?
That's a really interesting question. And it's an area of active research. There's a growing understanding of the connection between our gut and our kidneys, what's sometimes called the gut-kidney axis.
So what we eat could be impacting the health of our kidneys. That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And while the research isn't conclusive, some scientists believe that a dysregulated immune response to food, meaning the immune system is overreacting to certain components of food, might be linked to IgAN.
So it's not as simple as saying, like, eating this one food is going to cause IgAN, but more about how our individual immune systems might react to different foods.
Exactly. It's about that complex interplay between our genes, our environment, and our unique immune responses.
And speaking of the gut, we talked about the role of gut bacteria earlier. Could those bacteria also be influencing how our immune systems are reacting to food?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of why researchers are so interested in the gut microbiome. Think of it this way. The trillions of bacteria in our gut are constantly interacting with our immune system, shaping its responses. And the food we eat can directly impact the composition of those bacteria.
So it's like a complex ecosystem in our gut, with the bacteria, our food, and our immune system all influencing each other.
Precisely. And the article even highlights some research on fecal transplants in animal models of IgAN.
Fecal transplants, that sounds a little intense.
It might sound strange, but it's a promising area of research. The idea is that by transplanting fecal matter from a healthy donor, you can essentially repopulate the gut with a more diverse and balanced microbiome. It's like giving the gut a fresh start.
So could manipulating the gut microbiome through something like a fecal transplant actually become a treatment for IgAN in the future?
It's certainly a possibility, although more research is needed. But it highlights how important the gut microbiome is to our overall health, including the health of our kidneys.
Okay, so we've got genetics, infections, food, and gut bacteria all potentially playing a role in IgAN. Is there anything else we should consider?
Well, the article also dives into the role of genetic susceptibility. It seems that while most cases of IgAN are what we call sporadic, meaning they just happen seemingly randomly, there are some rare cases where it runs in families.
So IgAN can be inherited. Does that mean there's a specific gene that causes it?
It's not quite that simple. It appears that multiple genes, rather than a single gene, might be involved in increasing a person's susceptibility to developing IgAN. It's like having a combination of genetic factors that, together, tip the scales toward developing the disease.
So it's not just one gene, but maybe several genes interacting with each other and with the environment to influence the risk of IgAN.
That's the current thinking. It's a complex interplay of nature and nurture, our genes and our environment, shaping our susceptibility to this disease.
This is a lot to take in. We've covered the four-hit hypothesis, the potential roles of infections, food, gut bacteria, and genetics. It seems like everything is connected.
It really does highlight the interconnectedness of our bodies. But remember, we've been focusing on the potential triggers of IgAN. Now let's zoom in and explore what's happening inside the kidneys themselves, at the cellular level.
Okay, so we're going deeper into how those immune complexes we talked about actually cause damage. Let's dive in.
Remember we talked about the mesangium, that filtering unit in the kidneys where those immune complexes tend to get stuck.
Yeah, it was like those clumps of protein were clogging up the filtration system.
Exactly. Well, it turns out it's not just about them getting stuck. It's about how our bodies deal with them once they're there. The article talks about a process called mesangial cell receptor-mediated endocytosis.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Can you break that down for me?
Imagine those mesangial cells in the kidneys as having tiny little vacuum cleaners on their surface. These vacuum cleaners, which are actually special receptors, can bind to those IgA immune complexes and suck them up, clearing them out of the system.
So it's like a cellular cleanup crew trying to remove those harmful complexes.
Precisely. But here's the thing. In IgAN, this cleanup process might not be working as efficiently as it should.
So even if the kidneys are trying to clean up the mess, they might not be able to keep up.
That's one theory. And as those immune complexes build up, they trigger inflammation and damage to the kidneys. It's like the garbage disposal in your sink getting clogged. If it can't remove the waste effectively, it starts to back up and cause problems.
Okay, so we've got these immune complexes getting stuck in the kidneys, and the cleanup crew might not be able to keep up. What happens next?
Well, the article highlights a couple things. First, remember that complement system we talked about? That amplifier of the immune response? It seems to play a role in the damage process, too. When those immune complexes get stuck in the kidneys, they can activate the complement system, which basically ramps up the inflammation and makes things worse.
So it's like calling in the fire department, but instead of putting out the fire, they accidentally make it bigger?
It's a good analogy. The complement system is powerful. And when it's not properly regulated, it can cause more harm than good.
And you mentioned earlier that those immune complexes might not just be causing trouble in the mesangium. What about those podocytes, those important filtering cells we talked about?
Ah, yes, the podocytes. It seems they might be more involved than we initially thought. The article points to a fascinating concept called mesangial cell podocyte crosstalk.
Crosstalk, like they're having a conversation.
In a way, yes. It refers to the communication that happens between these two types of cells. And what's interesting is that this communication might be contributing to the progression of IgAN.
So what are these cells saying to each other?
Well, imagine the mesangial cells, under attack from those immune complexes. Start sending out distress signals. These signals are actually molecules that can be picked up by nearby cells, including podocytes.
And those distress signals are bad news for the podocytes.
Unfortunately, yes, some of these signals can trigger podocyte injury, leading to their dysfunction or even death. It's like the mesangium under siege accidentally sends out messages that harm the podocytes.
So it's not just the immune complexes themselves causing damage, but also the signals released by the cells that are under attack.
That's what the research suggests. It's like a chain reaction of damage, spreading from one cell type to another. And this brings us to another important concept mentioned in the article: fibrosis.
Fibrosis, isn't that scarring?
Exactly. And it's a key feature of chronic kidney disease. Fibrosis happens when the normal, healthy tissue of the kidneys gets replaced by scar tissue, which doesn't function properly.
So all this inflammation and damage from the immune complexes, the complement system, and the mesangial cell podocyte crosstalk can eventually lead to scarring of the kidneys.
That's a big part of the progression of IgAN. And the article points to several pathways involved in this fibrosis process, including the renin-angiotensin system, which is involved in regulating blood pressure.
So it's not just about the immune system, it's about these broader physiological systems getting involved and potentially making things worse.
Exactly. It's like a domino effect, with one problem leading to another. And to complicate things further, there are other pathways common to many chronic kidney diseases that also likely play a role in IgAN, such as those involving the mineralocorticoid receptor system, TGF-beta, and what beta-catenin signaling.
Wow, it's like a whole cascade of events with multiple systems and pathways contributing to the damage.
It's a complex and multifaceted disease, that's for sure. But here's the good news. By understanding these pathways, researchers are identifying new targets for potential therapies. The more we learn about the intricate workings of IgAN, the closer we get to developing more effective treatments to slow down or even reverse its progression.
That's encouraging to hear. This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information, but it's been fascinating to learn about the cellular and molecular intricacies of IgAN. We've gone from the big picture to the microscopic details.
And we still got more to explore. But for now, let's shift gears and talk about what all of this means for you, our listener. How can we apply this knowledge to understand this complex disease and its potential impact? So we've been talking about all this damage that can happen in the kidneys, but the article also pointed out that sometimes those IgA immune complex deposits can actually be reversible.
Wait, really? So just because those complexes get stuck in the kidneys, it doesn't automatically mean there's going to be permanent damage?
That seems to be what the research is suggesting. It seems like the kidneys have some built-in mechanisms to try and clear out those deposits. The article mentions something called mesangial cell receptor-mediated endocytosis.
Okay, that sounds kind of complicated.
It is a bit of a mouthful, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. Remember those mesangial cells we talked about? The ones in the filtering units of the kidneys?
Uh-huh.
Well, they have these special receptors on their surface that can bind to those IgA complexes.
So it's like they have little arms that can reach out and grab those harmful complexes.
That's a great way to think about it. And once they've grabbed onto those complexes, the mesangial cells can engulf them and break them down, essentially removing them from the kidneys.
So it's like a built-in cleaning system.
Exactly. The kidneys are pretty amazing, aren't they? But here's the thing. In IgAN, this cleaning system might not be working as efficiently as it should. It could be that there are just too many immune complexes for the mesangial cells to handle. Or maybe the cleaning process itself is impaired in some way.
So even though the kidneys are trying their best to clean up the mess, they might not be able to keep up.
That's what the research seems to suggest. And when those immune complexes start to accumulate, that's when the inflammation and damage really start to take hold.
Yeah. It's like a losing battle against this relentless tide of immune complexes.
That's a good analogy. And to make matters worse, those immune complexes might be causing more trouble than we initially thought. Remember we were talking about the communication between mesangial cells and podocytes, that crosstalk that can lead to podocyte injury.
Yeah. It was like those mesangial cells under attack were sending out distress signals that were harmful to the podocytes.
Well, it seems like that crosstalk might be even more complex than we realized. The article highlights some research suggesting that certain factors released by mesangial cells in response to those immune complexes might actually be directly contributing to fibrosis, that scarring process we talked about.
So it's not just the immune complexes themselves causing damage, but also these signals they trigger that are leading to scarring. It's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected everything is within the kidneys. One thing goes wrong, and it can set off a cascade of events. That ultimately leads to fibrosis and chronic kidney disease.
This is all getting pretty complicated, but it's also incredibly fascinating to see how much we're learning about the intricate workings of the kidneys and how this disease progresses.
It really is amazing. And the more we learn, the better equipped we are to develop new treatments that can target the specific mechanisms involved in IgAN.
So what does all this mean for someone listening who might be concerned about IgAN? What's the key takeaway?
I think the most important thing to remember is that IgAN is a complex disease with multiple factors at play. It's not just one thing causing the problems, a combination of genetics, the immune system, environmental triggers, and potentially even the bacteria in our gut.
And it's not just about the initial damage from those immune complexes. It's also about how the body responds to that damage and all those downstream pathways that can lead to fibrosis and chronic kidney disease.
Exactly. And while there's still much we don't know about IgAN, the research is advancing rapidly, leading to new insights and potential therapeutic targets.
So there's hope for better treatments and outcomes for people with IgAN.
Absolutely. And for our listener, if you have any concerns or questions, the best thing you can do is talk to your doctor. They can provide personalized advice and guidance based on your individual situation.
That's great advice. And I think that's a perfect note to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored a lot of complex information, but hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of this fascinating and challenging disease. As always, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, knowledge is power.
Well said. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Hey everyone, so I see you're ready to learn more about this thing called IgA nephropathy. A lot of people are curious about how it shows up, the symptoms and all, and how doctors actually figure out if someone has it or not. So that's what we're going to do today, dive deep into all of that. We're going to be looking at this recent medical document from UpToDate. It's super detailed, all about IgA nephropathy. It's like the ultimate guide, you know.
Like, it really is. And to think IgA nephropathy is more common than most people think.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's actually the most common cause of primary glomerulonephritis.
Whoa, so it's kind of a big deal then, huh?
Yeah, it is. In developed countries, at least.
Okay, so let's get back to basics.
Yeah.
What exactly is IgA nephropathy? I mean, the name kind of sounds a little intimidating.
Okay, so, well, you can think of IgA nephropathy or IgAN. We'll just call it IgAN for short. It's kind of like a mix-up in your immune system.
Like a mix-up.
Yeah, it's a kidney disease. The thing is, a specific antibody starts building up in your kidneys.
Oh, okay.
And this antibody, it's called immunoglobulin A, IgA. And this buildup, it causes inflammation in your kidneys.
Oh, so like your body's kind of attacking itself.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. It's like a fire alarm is going off in your kidneys. And, over time, that can cause damage. It affects how well your kidneys filter waste from your blood, which is obviously a problem.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
So is this something that's like equally common everywhere?
Well, that's the thing. The reported prevalence of IgAN, it actually varies quite a bit across the world. Like, you see higher rates in East Asia than you do in North America, for instance.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it might be because of a few different things, genetics maybe, and also just variations in like screening programs.
Oh, so some countries are just better at catching it early.
It could be, yeah. In some countries, they do routine urine testing and biopsies more often, even for something like blood in the urine, which seems simple.
Oh, I see.
So that means they might be catching a lot more IgAN cases early on.
It's like they're casting a wider net, right?
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So it might be more widespread than we even realize, but it could be going undetected in places where they don't screen as much,
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there anything else that affects, like, who gets it? You mentioned genetics.
Oh, yeah. Well, another interesting thing is that IgAN, it tends to show up most often in people in their 20s and 30s.
Oh, wow. That's younger than I would have thought.
Yeah, it is. And it's seen more frequently in men, too, at least in certain populations.
Huh. Fascinating. So let's picture this, someone has a kidney biopsy and the doctor's looking at it under a microscope. What would actually give it away as IgAN? Like, what would they see?
Okay, well, think of it this way. Okay, so your kidneys are like a house.
Okay.
A biopsy is like taking a tiny sample of the building material, to see what's going on inside the walls.
I like that.
So with IgAN, one of the main things doctors look for is those IgA deposits we talked about. They've got these special dyes, and they make these deposits light up under the microscope. It's almost like a neon sign pointing right at the problem. Oh, wow. That's cool. So it's like one of those blacklight posters where you see a hidden image.
Exactly.
So finding those deposits, that's a sure sign of IgAN.
Well, they're definitely a major red flag, yeah.
Okay.
It's not just about the deposits themselves, though. It's also about how much damage they've caused. Doctors use this system. It's called the Oxford classification.
Okay.
It's like a grading system for IgAN. They look at all these different features under the microscope, kind of like they're checking how bad the cracks in a wall are,
So the higher the grade, the more damage there is.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
And this classification helps them predict how the disease might, progress.
And that helps them decide on treatment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like the higher the grade, the more likely someone might need medication or, other things to protect their kidneys.
That makes sense. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for me. The document mentions that sometimes these IgA deposits, they can actually be found in people who seem perfectly healthy. How is that even possible? It seems kind of counterintuitive. It's a good question. It really shows how complex IgAN is. Just having those deposits, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to have problems, Think of it like you might have the genes for a certain hair color, but that doesn't mean you'll definitely have that hair color.
I see. So it's like a possibility, not a guarantee.
Yeah, exactly. Like having those deposits, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get full-blown IgAN. It's like having a predisposition for something.
It's like having a loaded gun, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fire.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There are all these other things that decide whether those deposits actually do damage to the kidneys or not.
Interesting.
Yeah, researchers are still trying to figure out, why some people with deposits get serious kidney problems and others are fine.
Wow, it's like a biological mystery, right?
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about what IgAN looks like under a microscope, but how does it actually, show up in people? What kind of symptoms should we be looking out for?
Well, that's the tricky thing. IgAN, it can be a bit of a chameleon.
What do you mean?
Like, it shows up in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes it's dramatic.
Oh, so it's not always obvious.
Not always, no. One of the most common symptoms that can be kind of alarming is hematuria. It
Hematuria.
just means blood in the urine.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes you can actually see it, like it'll have a pinkish color, but sometimes you can only see it with a lab test.
Okay, yeah. That definitely sounds like something's wrong.
It's definitely a red flag, yeah. And the thing is, with IgAN, a lot of times this hematuria, it happens when someone has an upper respiratory infection, like a cold or the flu.
Oh, so like you get a cold and then suddenly there's blood in your urine.
Yeah, pretty much.
I can imagine that would be pretty scary.
It can be, yeah. But the good news is that a lot of times these episodes, even though they're scary, they usually go away on their own.
Okay, so it's not always a sign of something really bad happening.
Not necessarily, but it's still important to get checked out, because even if the blood goes away, the problem in the kidneys, it might still be there, doing damage silently.
So it's kind of like a warning light flashing on your car's dashboard. You don't want to ignore it.
Exactly. And so while blood in the urine is one of the more, dramatic signs, some people have much milder symptoms, like they might just feel tired, have some swelling, or just feel a bit off in general.
So it can be sneaky too.
Yeah, it can be. That's why it's so important to pay attention to what your body's telling you, and talk to your doctor if something just doesn't feel right.
Makes sense. All right, so we've covered some of the ways IgAN can show up, but are there any other conditions that kind of look like it? How do doctors know that it's IgAN and not something else?
Oh, yeah, that's important. There are a lot of kidney conditions, and they can have similar symptoms. Doctors have to be like detectives, putting all the clues together.
Yeah, like a medical puzzle.
Exactly. So sometimes there are a few other conditions that can look like IgAN under the microscope, even with those IgA deposits. Like there's this thing called Henoch-Schönlein purpura, HSP.
HSP?
Yeah, it can affect the kidneys and you can see IgA deposits, but usually there's also a rash, joint pain, and stomach pain.
Oh, so those other symptoms help differentiate it from IgAN.
Yeah, they can. And then there's lupus nephritis, which can also have IgA deposits. But with lupus, you see other signs too, like fatigue, joint pain, and that butterfly rash on the face.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
So it really is like putting together a puzzle, all these different pieces of information.
exactly. Doctors, they consider a person's medical history, family history, any medications they take, and the results from blood and urine tests on
Okay.
top of the biopsy findings to make sure they get the diagnosis right.
Wow, it's a lot more complicated than I thought.
It can be, yeah.
You mentioned blood and urine tests.
Mm-hmm.
What are they looking for in those where they think it might be IgAN?
Well, one of the main things is protein in the urine. If there's protein, it could mean the kidneys aren't filtering properly, which can happen in IgAN and other kidney diseases. And of course, they'll also check for blood in the urine, like we were talking about before, and they'll look at kidney function tests. Those tests can tell them how well the kidneys are working overall.
So they're getting information from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah, exactly. Like assembling a team of experts, Each test provides a piece of the puzzle, and then all together they help paint the full picture of what's happening.
Okay, so it's clear that a lot goes into diagnosing IgAN. But what happens next? What about treatment? What can someone expect if they are diagnosed with this?
Well, that's a great question, and one that we're going to dive into a lot more in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back. We've established that, wow, diagnosing IgAN can be a real detective story.
It can be.
But let's say we figured it out. We've cracked the case. What happens next?
Okay, well, so the good news is that not everyone who has IgAN actually needs treatment right away.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like for some people, especially if their symptoms are pretty mild and their kidney function is stable,
Okay.
then like a watch and wait approach might be the best thing.
So it's not always like rushing into medication or anything?
No, not at all. It's about finding that balance, like keep an eye on the disease, but only intervene when you really need to.
I see.
So usually doctors recommend lifestyle changes first. Like that's the first line of defense.
Makes sense. So what kind of lifestyle changes are we talking about? Can you give us some examples?
Well, a lot of them are pretty similar to, just general good health recommendations.
Okay, so like eating healthy, exercising.
Yeah, exactly. Eating a balanced diet, keeping your blood pressure under control, getting regular exercise, not smoking, all that.
It's all connected, right?
It is. But then there are some specific tweaks you can make to your diet that might be extra helpful for people with IgAN.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It was.
So, for example, limiting your sodium intake can help with managing blood pressure, which is really important to protect the kidneys.
Okay, yeah.
And there's some research suggesting that eating less protein might also help slow down the damage to the kidneys.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about eating healthy. It's about, like, fine-tuning it for your kidneys.
Exactly, yeah. But of course, you should always talk to your doctor or a registered dietitian before making any big changes, you know? Make sure it's safe for you specifically.
Yeah, always good advice. You mentioned medications earlier. When do those usually come into play?
Well, usually doctors consider medication if lifestyle changes aren't enough to really control the disease.
Hmm.
Like, say someone has high blood pressure, even though they're doing all the right things.
Okay.
Then they might need blood pressure medication, right?
Makes sense.
Another common one is when someone has a lot of proteinuria.
Protein.
It means they're losing a lot of protein in their urine, which can be a sign of kidney damage. So there are medications that can help with that, reduce the proteinuria, and protect the kidneys.
So it's like plugging the leaks in the kidneys.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And sometimes, especially if the IgAN is more aggressive, doctors might think about using immunosuppressant medications.
Immunosuppressants. Oh, right. Those are the ones that, like, suppress the immune system, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But wait, why would you want to do that for IgAN?
Well, remember how we were saying that IgAN is kind of like an immune system mix-up?
Yeah.
So in some cases, if you suppress the immune system a bit, it can help reduce that inflammation in the kidneys, slow down the damage.
So it's like telling the immune system to calm down a bit, right?
Yeah, basically. But the thing is, immunosuppressants, they can have side effects.
Right, of course.
So they're not something you use lightly. Doctors really have to weigh the risks and benefits for each person before deciding to use them.
That makes sense. So, this whole deep dive is focused on the clinical side of IgAN, but I'm also curious about the human side of it. Like, what's it actually like to live with this condition?
Oh, yeah, that's a really important question because IgAN can affect people in so many ways, not just physically, but emotionally and socially too.
I imagine so.
Yeah, and one of the toughest things is the uncertainty.
Uncertainty. In what way?
Well, IgAN can be unpredictable. Some people have very mild symptoms and their kidney function stays pretty stable for years. But then others, the disease progresses much faster and it can even lead to kidney failure.
Oh, wow. So it's like a roller coaster. You never know what's coming next.
Yeah, kind of. And that uncertainty can really weigh on people. They might worry about needing dialysis or a transplant down the line, and that can affect their outlook on life, their relationships, even their ability to make plans for the future.
Yeah, that's understandable. It's hard to live your life to the fullest when you have that hanging over your head.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to have a strong support system. Talking to family and friends, joining support groups, maybe even seeing a therapist or counselor.
Yeah.
All those things can make a big difference in coping with the emotional side of things.
Absolutely. What about physically, though? Like, how does IgAN affect someone's daily life, day to day?
Well, the symptoms themselves can be pretty bothersome. Fatigue is a really common complaint, and that can make it hard to keep up with work, school, social stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Some people have swelling, especially in their legs and ankles, which can be uncomfortable and make it hard to get around. And then if the kidneys aren't working as well as they should, that can lead to a buildup of waste products in the blood. It just makes you feel generally unwell.
So it really can impact your quality of life.
It can, yeah. And then there are the dietary restrictions, that often come with managing kidney disease.
Right.
Having to limit certain foods and drinks can be a tough adjustment, especially if you're used to eating a certain way.
It's like having to relearn how to eat all over again.
It can feel that way, and it can also be socially isolating, especially if you're used to, sharing meals with friends and family.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. We were talking about medications earlier, too. I imagine managing all those meds can be a bit of a headache, literally and figuratively.
It can be, yeah. Some people end up taking multiple medications, and they all have their own schedules and potential side effects.
So it's like having a part-time job just keeping track of your pills.
It can feel that way, definitely. And it can be really overwhelming, especially on top of all the other challenges of IgAN.
So what can people do to make that part easier, the medication part?
Well, I think the most important thing is communication. Talk to your doctor.
Okay.
Be open about any concerns you have about your medications. They can help you understand, why you're taking each one, how to take it properly, what side effects to look out for.
It's about building a good relationship with your doctor.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. The more you know about your meds, the better you can manage them.
That's true for pretty much everything in life, I think. Okay, so we've talked about the impact of IgAN on individuals, but what about the bigger picture? Like, how does it affect society as a whole?
Well, IgAN is definitely a big public health concern, no doubt about that.
Okay.
It puts a lot of strain on healthcare systems worldwide. It's one of the leading causes of kidney failure, and kidney failure is just really expensive to manage. You often need dialysis or a transplant, and those are both really resource intensive.
So IgAN isn't just an individual problem, it's a societal problem too.
Exactly. The cost of treating kidney failure, hospital stays, medications, lost productivity, it all adds up.
Yeah.
And those costs are usually carried by individuals, families, and healthcare systems.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a huge burden. So what can we do about it? About this societal impact?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just raising awareness about the disease. A lot of people have never even heard of IgAN, so if we can make more people aware of it, that could really help with early detection and prevention.
So it's about getting the word out there.
Yeah, exactly. And then also advocating for more research funding. The more we understand about IgAN, the better we'll be able to develop effective treatments and ways to prevent kidney failure from happening in the first place.
Makes sense. You mentioned prevention earlier. Is there anything people can actually do to lower their risk of getting IgAN?
That's a good question. Researchers are still trying to figure that out for sure.
Okay.
There's no foolproof way to prevent it completely, but there are some things that might help.
Okay, so give us the inside scoop. What can we do?
Well, like we were talking about before, a healthy lifestyle is always a good foundation, right?
Yeah, okay.
Eating right, staying active, managing stress, not smoking, all of that good stuff.
So like what our moms have been telling us our whole lives.
Yeah, pretty much. But specifically for IgAN, there's some new research that suggests gut health might be important.
Oh, interesting. What's the connection there?
Well, remember we talked about that link between IgAN and celiac disease?
Yeah.
Well, that's just one example of how gut health could be influencing IgAN. There's more and more evidence that the gut microbiome, those trillions of bacteria that live in your digestive tract,
Oh, right.
well, it turns out they can actually affect immune function throughout the body, including in the kidneys.
Wow, so it's like this whole other ecosystem living inside us that can mess with our kidneys.
It is pretty wild, and researchers are finding that when the gut microbiome is out of balance, it's called dysbiosis, that can be linked to a bunch of health problems, including kidney disease.
So if we can keep those little guys happy in our gut, we might be able to avoid IgAN.
That's the idea. But this is still a pretty new area of research. They need to do more studies to really understand how the gut microbiome and IgAN are connected and how we can use that information to help people.
Okay, so gut health is definitely something to keep in mind. What about genetics? Like if it runs in your family, are you more likely to get IgAN?
That's another hot topic in research right now. We know that IgAN does tend to run in families, so there's definitely a genetic component. And they have found some genes that seem to be involved, but it's not just one single gene, it's a whole bunch of them interacting with each other.
So it's not like inheriting the gene for blue eyes or something.
So, not that simple, unfortunately. It's more like you inherit a bunch of genes that might make you a little more susceptible to IgAN, but it's not a guarantee.
I see.
Environmental factors probably play a role too. That classic nature versus nurture thing.
Right, right. So is there any kind of genetic testing available for IgAN then?
Not really, no. I mean, researchers are looking into it, but those tests aren't used in everyday practice. Not yet, at least.
Okay, so it's not something you can just ask your doctor about at this point.
Not yet, no. But keep an eye out, research is moving fast, so who knows, maybe someday we'll have a simple test that can tell us who's at higher risk and help us intervene earlier.
Wow, that would be amazing. Okay, so lots of exciting things happening in the IgAN world. It seems like we've covered so much already, from diagnosis to treatment to the challenges and even the impact on society.
Yeah, we have covered a lot.
But before we wrap things up, I do want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, those non-invasive diagnostic tests for IgAN that are in development.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to talk about those in more detail and some other exciting research avenues in the final part of our IgAN journey, so stay tuned. All right, so we're back, and this is it, the final part of our IgAN deep dive. And honestly, this is the part I've been looking forward to the most. We're going to talk about those new diagnostic tests that are being developed, the non-invasive ones.
Yeah, they're really exciting. They could totally change how we think about IgAN. Diagnosing it, monitoring it, even deciding on treatment, it could all be different.
I can see why you're excited. I mean, the simple blood test or urine test, that would be so much easier than a kidney biopsy.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So what exactly are researchers looking for with these new tests?
Okay, well, one of the most promising things is this thing called galactose-deficient Ig1. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so
Yeah.
basically it's a specific type of IgA that seems to be the main trigger for that inflammation in the kidneys.
Oh.
And it's often elevated in people with IgAN.
So if your levels of this galactose-deficient IgA1 are high, that's a bad sign.
It's definitely a big clue, yeah.
Okay.
And there are already some tests that can measure it, but they still need to do more research, make sure they're accurate for everybody.
Right. Got to make sure it really work.
Yeah.
So that's one thing they're looking at. What else is on the research radar?
Another really interesting area is microRNAs.
MicroRNA.
MicroRNAs. Yeah, they're these tiny little molecules that can actually control gene expression.
Whoa, that's cool.
Yeah, and they're finding that some of these miRNAs are acting differently in people with IgAN.
So by measuring them, you could kind of see how active the disease is, maybe even how it's going to progress.
That's the hope. It's like getting a sneak peek inside, seeing what the disease is actually doing.
I like that.
So they're trying to figure out which miRNAs are the most important and develop tests that can measure them accurately.
It sounds like the future of IgAN diagnosis is going to be a lot less scary and a lot more precise.
It really does.
That's great news.
And it's not just about diagnosis either. They're also working on totally new treatments that target the actual causes of IgAN.
Oh, wow. So instead of just managing the symptoms, they're going after the root of the problem.
Exactly. Like some researchers are looking at ways to block that galactose-deficient IgA1 from being made in the first place.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
And others are working on therapies that can kind of adjust the immune response in the kidneys,
Right.
calm down that overactive immune system.
That sounds like some serious cutting-edge science. Are any of these new treatments available yet?
Some of them are actually in clinical trials already.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, so they're testing them in humans to see if they're safe and if they work.
So there's real hope for better treatments in the near future.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, we can't forget about that gut microbiome connection either.
Right, right.
Researchers are looking at ways to change the gut microbiome, maybe using probiotics or even fecal transplant.
Fecal transplants for IgAN. That's wild.
Oh, it is. They're trying to see if that can have an effect on the disease.
It seems like there's a lot to be optimistic about with all this IgAN research going on.
Definitely, yeah. There's so much happening, and we're learning more and more every day.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We started with the basics, then we went all the way to the cutting edge of research.
It has been a journey.
I feel like I have a much better grasp on this whole IgAN thing now.
Yeah.
That's a lot more common and a lot more complicated than I realized.
It is. It is. It's been great exploring it with you.
Likewise.
Hmm.
Before we sign off, though, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. IgAN, it can be tough, but you're not alone, There are resources out there, support groups, online forums, where you can connect with other people who get it.
Yeah, that's so important. It can make a huge difference just knowing you're not going through this alone.
Exactly. And remember, research is always moving forward, so stay informed, stay hopeful, and if you want to learn even more, check out the UpToDate document we used for this deep dive. It's all about IgA nephropathy, super detailed.
Yes, definitely check that out. And of course, talk to your doctor if you have any concerns about your own health. They can give you the best advice for your specific situation.
That's great advice. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of IgA nephropathy. We'll see you next time for another exploration of something fascinating.
Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're taking a close look at IgA nephropathy, or IgAN for short.
IgAN. Yeah.
We're using some great research from UpToDate to break it all down.
Awesome.
So we're going to be figuring out what exactly IgAN is, how it's treated,
Right.
and what it means for you down the road.
Sounds good.
You might be surprised to hear this,
Okay.
but IgAN is actually the most common cause of a specific type of kidney inflammation in developed countries.
Huh. That is interesting.
Wild, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's get started. To really get why that's so surprising, we need to talk about glomerulonephritis.
Okay.
So IgAN is the leading cause of what's called primary glomerulonephritis.
Primary glomerulonephritis.
Basically, it's the main reason those tiny filters in your kidneys, the glomeruli, get inflamed.
Okay.
When there's no other known kidney disease causing it, that is.
So it's like IgAN is public enemy number one when these filters get inflamed, seemingly out of nowhere.
Gotcha. And while inflammation might sound kind of minor,
Right.
it can cause some serious problems down the line if it's not taken care of.
Oh, I see.
Think of the glomeruli like a fine mesh sieve. Their job is to filter the waste from your blood.
Okay, a sieve.
When they get inflamed, the sieve starts to get leaky.
Leaky sieve.
That's where the trouble begins.
Okay, so leaky filters. Got it. What kind of trouble are we talking about here?
Well, one of the biggest worries is that EGAN can silently progress to end-stage kidney disease,
End-stage kidney disease.
or ESKD for short.
Okay.
And it happens to a significant number of people, about 25 to 30% within 20 to 25 years.
Wow, those are some sobering numbers. So early detection's got to be super important, right?
Absolutely. And to catch it early, doctors look for some telltale signs.
Okay.
One of the most important is proteinuria,
Proteinuria.
meaning there's too much protein in your urine.
Why is protein in the urine such a big deal? I don't really get it.
It's a sign that those glomeruli, the tiny filters, are damaged. They're leaking protein that should be staying in your bloodstream. Imagine a tea bag.
A tea bag.
If the bag's intact, the tea stays inside, right?
Yeah.
But if it's ripped,
Uh-oh.
tea leaves go everywhere.
Yeah.
Protein in the urine is like finding those tea leaves in your cup. It means the filter's not working the way it should.
Oh, I get the tea bag thing. So the more protein in the urine, the more damaged those filters are.
Exactly.
And the higher the risk of things going downhill.
Exactly. Studies show that when proteinuria is high, over 1 gram per day,
1 gram per day.
especially over a long time,
Okay.
the disease progresses much faster, like way faster.
How much faster are we talking?
Some studies say up to 24 times faster.
Whoa, 24 times.
Yeah,
All right, so that's definitely a big red flag.
it is.
So if someone has low proteinuria, are they in the clear?
Not so fast. Even with lower levels, there's still a chance kidney function could decline,
Oh, I see.
especially if they also have blood in their urine.
Okay, so proteinuria and blood in the urine, two major red flags for IgAN. What else are doctors looking at?
Well, hypertension or high blood pressure, that's another big one.
High blood pressure.
If someone already has it when they're diagnosed with IgAN, it's
Yeah.
generally not a good sign.
Oh, that makes sense. It's like insult to injury, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
Why would that be, though? Why is high blood pressure so bad in this case?
It's not 100% clear,
Okay.
but it probably has to do with the extra stress high blood pressure puts on those already damaged glomeruli.
I can see that.
Like, imagine trying to force water through a damaged filter.
Oh, yeah.
Higher pressure.
Yeah.
It's going to wear out faster. One study showed that after 20 years, people with hypertension at diagnosis were way more likely to need dialysis or even, not make it compared to those without hypertension.
Wow. That really drives home how important it is to manage blood pressure if you have IgAN.
Absolutely. It's a cornerstone of treatment.
So we've got proteinuria, blood in the urine, and hypertension. Anything else doctors are looking at when they're assessing someone's risk with IgAN?
Yeah, there's the level of kidney function at the time of diagnosis.
Okay.
That's super important.
Makes sense.
They use a measurement called eGFR.
eGFR.
It estimates how well your kidneys are filtering waste.
Okay.
Lower eGFR, it means those kidneys aren't functioning as well, and that's linked to a worse outlook.
So the earlier you catch IgAN,
Yes.
the better your chances of protecting your kidneys.
Exactly.
What about blood in the urine?
Hematuria.
Hematuria. How big of a deal is that when it comes to risk?
That one's a bit tricky.
Really?
The research on hematuria has been a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some studies say one thing, others say another.
So what's the bottom line?
It does seem that persistent microscopic hematuria,
Okay.
the kind you can only see under a microscope,
Right.
that's linked to a faster disease progression.
So even if you can't see it with the naked eye, if there's blood in the urine consistently, that's a sign things could be going downhill faster.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
One study even found higher rates of ESKD, or a 50% reduction in kidney function, in people with persistent microscopic hematuria,
Oh, wow.
compared to those without it, I mean.
Right.
But here's the thing. No studies have shown that just treating hematuria by itself, without also going after that proteinuria, actually helps slow things down.
Okay, so it's all about understanding the full picture of what's happening in the kidneys.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the bigger picture, what about the kidney biopsy itself? Can that tell us anything about how serious the IgAN is?
Oh yeah, for sure. A kidney biopsy gives us a ton of information.
Okay.
Doctors are looking for certain patterns that might signal a higher risk of problems later on, especially patterns that show both inflammation and signs of chronic damage, like scarring.
So it's like a sneak peek inside the kidneys, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I can see what's really going on.
Exactly.
See what's really going on.
Exactly.
How do doctors even analyze those biopsies? Is there like a system?
They use something called the Oxford classification.
Oxford classification.
It basically scores the biopsies based on different features.
Okay.
Think of it like a grading system for the damage.
Interesting.
They look at things like how much inflammation there is, how much scarring,
Right.
and whether there are any crescent formations, these little pockets of inflammation that can really hurt the glomeruli.
So even if someone's not feeling that bad, the Oxford classification can tell doctors how bad their IgAN actually is.
You got it. And that actually leads us to another tool, the International IgA Nephropathy Prediction Tool.
The what now?
The International IgA Nephropathy Prediction Tool, or IgAN-PT for short.
Okay, the IgAN PT. Sounds fancy. What does it do?
It takes all the stuff we've been talking about, age, proteinuria levels,
Right.
blood pressure, race,
Okay.
ethnicity, even whether someone's been taking certain blood pressure meds, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Then it combines all that with the Oxford classification score from the biopsy.
So it's crunching a lot of numbers. What's the outcome?
It gives you an estimate of their 5-year risk of, things really taking a turn for the worse.
So like a crystal ball for IgAN?
Not exactly.
Okay.
It can't tell you how someone's going to respond to a particular treatment,
Right.
but it gives both the doctors and the patients a much clearer idea of what they're dealing with.
That's helpful.
It definitely helps guide treatment decisions.
Okay, so that's a relief. At least you have some idea of what you might be up against. So with all this in mind, what are doctors aiming for when they're treating someone with IgAN? What are the goals?
The ultimate goal is to stop end-stage kidney disease from happening.
That's the big one, right?
Yeah.
How do they actually do that, though?
2 key strategies, really.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, they try to lower that proteinuria, get it to less than 1 gram per day.
1 gram per day.
Ideally, even less than 0.5 grams. This is huge because controlling proteinuria has been shown to slow the disease progression way down.
So it's like slamming on the brakes before the kidneys get too damaged.
Exactly.
Awesome.
The second strategy is improving what we call urinary sediment.
Urinary sediment.
Basically, getting rid of any blood in the urine.
Oh, right.
Because we know if it sticks around, that could spell trouble.
So it's like a trifecta of goals.
Yep.
Prevent ESKD, lower proteinuria, and get rid of blood in the urine.
Exactly.
How do they actually achieve that?
Well, the foundation of treatment for all IgAN patients, doesn't matter how severe it is what we call optimized supportive care.
Okay, optimized supportive care. That's a mouthful. What's that actually look like?
It's kind of a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
One key element is something called renin-angiotensin system inhibition.
Renin-angiotensin what now?
Renin-angiotensin system inhibition. Doctors usually use medications like ACE inhibitors or ARBs for this.
ACE inhibitors and ARBs. Familiar with those?
Yep, those are the ones.
Okay, and these actually protects the kidneys. How does that work?
They work on a couple different levels.
I'm interested.
They can help lower blood pressure, which we already know is super important.
Right.
They also directly reduce proteinuria, taking some of the burden off those struggling glomeruli.
Oh, okay.
And some research even suggests they might have anti-inflammatory effects.
So they're like little multitaskers.
Exactly.
Working hard to keep those kidneys healthy.
Yep, they're a key part of the treatment plan.
Okay, so what else is part of this supportive care approach?
Well, there's this new type of drug called SGLT2 inhibitors that's been showing some real promise.
SGLT2 inhibitors, huh? I think I've heard of those in connection with diabetes.
You probably have. They were originally developed for diabetes.
Oh, right.
But turns out they have amazing benefits for kidney health.
Even for people without diabetes?
Even for folks without diabetes.
Huh. So how do they work?
It's a bit complicated.
Okay.
But basically, they block the reabsorption of glucose in the kidneys.
So they lower blood sugar?
Yeah, they lower blood sugar.
Right.
But they also have this incredible protective effect on the kidneys.
So it's a win-win for folks with diabetes and BE kidney issues.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and the research on these SGLT2 inhibitors for IgAN is really encouraging.
Oh. Tell me more.
Well, there was this big study called the DAPA-CKD trial.
DAPA-CKD.
It looked at a bunch of different kidney diseases.
Okay.
And it found that an SGLT2 inhibitor called dapagliflozin significantly reduced the risk of kidney failure or even death from kidney disease in patients with IgAN.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
So it's like first the ACE inhibitors or ARBs, and then bringing in the SGLT2 inhibitors for extra support.
Yeah.
You mentioned another drug earlier, sparsentan. Where does that fit into all of this?
Sparsentan, that's another interesting option for when the proteinuria just won't quit.
Oh, so for those stubborn cases.
Exactly.
How does that one work?
It's what we call a dual antagonist.
A dual antagonist, what does that even mean?
It means it blocks the action of 2 different pathways that contribute to kidney damage.
Okay, 2 birds, 1 stone kind of thing.
Yeah, basically. Specifically, it goes after both the angiotensin the 7 receptor and the endothelin 1 receptor.
I'm not super familiar with those. Can you break those down a bit more?
Sure. Think of them like signaling pathways that, when they're too active, can lead to all sorts of problems in the kidneys.
Okay,
Inflammation, scarring, and eventually damage.
that's not good.
Not good at all.
So sparsentan steps in and blocks those pathways, preventing the damage in the first place.
Exactly.
Pretty clever. Any downsides to using sparsentan?
There is one potential drawback.
What is it?
Sparsentan can sometimes cause liver problems.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so doctors have to monitor patients pretty closely with blood tests.
Okay, so it's a powerful drug, but it's important to keep an eye on those side effects.
You've got it.
So we've got the ACE inhibitors, or ARBs, SGLT2 inhibitors, and sparsentan, all working to protect those kidneys. Anything else that's considered part of this supportive care approach?
Well, controlling blood pressure. That's a big one for everyone with IgAN.
Right, of course.
The specific targets depend on each person, but the overall goal is to keep that blood pressure nice and low.
Makes sense. Anything else?
And then there are the lifestyle changes.
Ah, those good old healthy habits. What kind of things are we talking about?
The usual suspects, really.
Yeah.
A healthy diet, regular exercise, maintaining a healthy weight.
So all the things our moms have been telling us to do our whole lives.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's not always easy, but it can make a real difference for people with IgAN.
It really can.
And I'm guessing quitting smoking falls under that umbrella too.
Absolutely. Smoking's a big no-no for anyone with IgAN.
So supportive care, it's a whole package deal, right?
Yeah.
Medications, blood pressure control, and lifestyle changes all working together.
Exactly.
But what happens when supportive care just isn't enough?
Good question.
When someone's considered high risk, what then?
That's when we have to bring out the big guns.
Oh,
Intrigued.
definitely. What are these big guns you're talking about?
We call it immunosuppressive therapy.
Immunosuppressive therapy. That sounds pretty serious.
It can be.
What does it involve?
It involves using meds that suppress the immune system.
Okay, so like calming down the immune system so it stops attacking the kidneys?
That's the idea. It's all about finding the right balance.
So what kind of medications are we talking about here?
Often, the first choice is systemic glucocorticoids.
Glucocorticoids.
Steroids, basically.
Steroids. Those are pretty intense, aren't they?
They can be, yeah.
What kind of side effects are we talking about?
Things like weight gain,
Okay.
mood swings,
Uh-oh.
trouble sleeping, higher risk of infections.
Right.
Even bone thinning can happen.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. It's definitely a balancing act, weighing the benefits against the risks.
I imagine finding that right balance is really important.
Absolutely. But the good news is research is constantly moving forward,
Well, that's good.
leading to safer and more effective treatments all the time.
Great. Any examples?
Yeah, there was a study called the testing trial. It showed that using lower doses of steroids along with antibiotics to prevent infections was just as effective as high-dose steroids alone, but with fewer side effects.
So lower doses, same results, fewer risks. I like the sound of that. What about for people who can't tolerate steroids? Or who just don't want to take them?
There are a couple of other options. One is a drug called targeted-release budesonide.
Targeted release budesonide.
It's a type of steroid, but it's designed to be released in a specific part of the gut,
Okay.
where it has fewer side effects.
So it's like a smart bomb targeting the inflammation directly.
That's a great way to put it.
Are there any other alternatives?
There's also mycophenolate mofetil,
Mycophenolate mofetil. Okay.
or MMF.
MMF. Got it. How's that one work?
Works a little differently than steroids,
Okay.
but it also helps to suppress the immune system.
Are those alternatives as effective as steroids?
That's a good question, and to be honest, the jury's still out on that one.
Okay.
Some studies have shown promising results,
Right.
but we need more data to really know for sure how they measure up in the long run.
So those are two potential alternatives to systemic steroids for high-risk IgAN patients. Anything else out there being researched?
There are a few other immunosuppressants that are used less commonly, like calcineurin inhibitors
Okay.
and rituximab.
Rituximab. Okay.
But we need more research to know for sure if they really work for IgAN.
Sounds like the treatment landscape for high-risk IgAN is still evolving.
It is for sure.
Doctors really have to look at each person individually and figure out the best plan for them.
You got it. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Now, I know IgAN can show up in some unusual ways.
It can, yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about those special situations?
Sure. Sometimes IgAN presents alongside other kidney diseases.
Oh, that sounds complicated.
It can be. Makes diagnosis and treatment a bit trickier.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, sometimes EGON happens along with minimal change disease.
Minimal change disease.
It's more common in kids, but adults can get it too.
Okay.
And when these two conditions are both present, it really throws a wrench in things.
So how do they treat IgAN with minimal change disease?
They usually approach it the same way they treat primary minimal change disease,
Okay.
which often responds well to glucocorticoids, those steroids we talked about.
Okay, so even though it's more complicated, they still have a plan of attack.
They do.
What other unique presentations of IgAN are there?
Another one is EGON with acute kidney injury,
Acute kidney injury.
or AKI.
AKI, okay.
AKI means the kidneys suddenly decide to stop working properly.
Oh, wow.
It can happen for a bunch of different reasons.
Right.
And when it happens in someone with AGON, it's kind of an emergency.
That sounds scary. What do doctors do in that situation?
First things first, they focus on supportive care for the AKI itself.
Okay. Stabilize the patient.
Exactly. That might involve IV fluids, medications to control blood pressure,
Right.
or even dialysis if it's really bad.
Dialysis. Wow. Okay, so once they've stabilized the patient, what then?
They usually do a kidney biopsy.
Another biopsy.
It helps them understand what caused the AKI in the first place
Right.
and rule out any other serious problems.
So the biopsy helps them tailor the treatment more precisely.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got those two special situations. Anything else?
Oh, yeah, there's the most severe form called IgAN with rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis.
Rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. Okay, that sounds even more intense than AKI.
It is.
What is that exactly?
It's a really serious condition.
Okay.
Doctors have to treat it aggressively if they want to save the kidneys.
So what's the treatment for that?
They usually use a combo of cyclophosphamide, which is a powerful immunosuppressant,
Okay.
and the glucocorticoids, those steroids we talked about.
So they're really pulling out all the stops.
I have to. It's a race against time with this one.
Wow, so rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis is like IgAN on fast forward.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so what about pregnancy? Can women with IgAN safely have children?
Generally, yeah, it's fine. If their kidney function is good,
Okay.
IgAN doesn't usually cause problems during pregnancy.
That's good to know.
But it's important to be careful with medications because some of the meds used to treat IgAN can be harmful to a developing baby.
So it's a balancing act between treating the mother and protecting the baby.
Exactly.
What about children who are diagnosed with IgAN?
Ah, good question. IgAN in kids can be a whole different ballgame compared to adults.
Really? In what ways?
Well, kids are usually diagnosed earlier on in the disease, and their biopsies tend to show more of that active inflammation.
Okay.
But the good news is they don't usually have as much of those chronic changes like scarring.
Right.
So their chances of recovery are generally better.
So it's a mixed bag, but potentially more optimistic for kids.
You could say that.
What do doctors do when they diagnose a child with IgAN?
The key is to carefully assess each kid's risk and tailor the treatment to their specific needs.
So even more important to personalize care when it comes to children.
Oh, sure.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've really explored what IgAN is, what can make it worse, and all the ways doctors try to treat it.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I think we did a good job laying the groundwork for understanding this really complex disease.
Yeah, I think so too.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll get more into how doctors monitor and adjust treatment over time, talk about what it's actually like to live with IgAN,
Right.
and discuss those situations where, despite our best efforts, it progresses to end-stage kidney disease.
That sounds fascinating. Can't wait to dive into those topics.
That could be a good one.
All right, everyone, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll uncover even more about this complex condition.
See you there.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into IgA nephropathy. So we've covered a lot of ground already, from how IgAN affects those tiny filters in your kidneys to the different ways doctors try to treat it.
Right, we've covered a lot.
But now I think it's time to talk about how those treatments are actually monitored and adjusted over time.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Because IgAN, it's not like you just take a pill and poof, problem solved.
Definitely not. It's a journey.
It's more like fine-tuning an instrument, right?
Yeah.
You got to keep making adjustments to get the best sound.
I love that analogy.
And in this case, healthy kidneys are the sound we're going for.
Yeah, exactly.
So how often do doctors usually check in on someone with IgAN? What are they looking for?
It really depends on the individual person and what treatments they're getting.
Okay.
But generally, doctors will check kidney function every few months.
Every few months.
Yeah, usually with blood tests to measure creatinine levels. And get that eGFR number we talked about before, the one that tells us how well the kidneys are filtering.
Right, right.
And of course, they'll do urine tests to check for protein in blood.
So blood work and urinalysis, looking for clues about what's going on in those kidneys.
That's it.
And I'm guessing for someone on immunosuppressive therapy, those checkups are even more frequent?
You bet. Those medications can be pretty powerful.
Yeah.
So doctors want to make sure they're hitting that sweet spot, getting the benefits without too many risks.
Makes sense. So let's say someone's been on supportive care for a while, their proteinuria is still high, they're considered high risk, and they start immunosuppressive therapy, probably steroids.
Oh, yeah.
What happens then? How do doctors know if it's working?
After about 4 to 6 months of immunosuppressive therapy,
4 to 6 months.
doctors really start paying close attention to those lab results. They want to see if that proteinuria is going down,
Right.
if kidney function is staying stable or even getting better.
Yeah. So those are the good signs, the signs that the treatment's doing its job.
Exactly.
So what happens if things are looking good? Do they stay on the medication indefinitely?
Not usually.
Okay.
If the proteinuria has dropped below 1 gram per day and kidney function is stable or improving, doctors will usually start to taper off the steroids.
Oh, they taper them off.
Yeah. The goal is to stop them completely after about 6 months.
So steroids are more of a short-term solution.
Yeah. Think of them like a fire extinguisher. You use it to put out the fire of inflammation,
Right.
but you don't leave it running all the time.
Right, because of those side effects.
Exactly.
So 6 months of steroids, and then ideally you're done. What happens to those patients after that?
They go back to supportive care. But here's the thing. They still need to be monitored super closely.
So vigilance is key.
You got it. It's not a cure.
Right.
It's more like ongoing management.
Ongoing management. Okay.
Even if the steroids have worked their magic, there's always a chance that IgAN could flare up again.
So you can't get complacent.
Nope. And sometimes, even if the proteinuria hasn't quite reached that ideal target of below 1 gram per day, but it's come down significantly and kidney function is good, doctors might still taper those steroids and stop them after 6 months.
Okay, but why would they do that if the proteinuria hasn't hit the goal?
It's all about balancing those benefits and risks, right?
Right.
Sometimes taking steroids for more than 6 months just isn't worth it, even if the proteinuria isn't perfect.
So they're really looking at the big picture, weighing everything carefully.
Exactly. And even though they might stop the steroids, those supportive care measures, those keep going.
Okay.
And doctors might also think about adding MMF.
MMF, right. Mycophenolate mofetil, that alternative to steroids we talked about.
That's the one.
So it's like bringing in reinforcements to keep the iron under control.
Precisely.
But what happens if, even after 6 months of immunosuppressive therapy, that proteinuria is still high, like 1 gram per day or more, and it just won't budge?
That's when doctors really have to step back and strategize.
Because that doesn't sound good.
It's not ideal.
What are their options at that point?
They might try MMF for 4 to 6 months.
Okay.
Either stopping the steroids completely or keeping them at a low dose.
So they're switching things up, seeing if MMF might work better in that particular case.
Exactly. And if the proteinuria is really stubborn, like 2 grams per day or more, some doctors might even switch to that targeted release budesonide we mentioned before.
The smart bomb steroid.
That's the one.
Yeah.
But the important thing here is, if those treatments don't work,
Right.
if there's still proteinuria and blood in the urine after 6 months of MMF, it's time for another kidney biopsy.
Another biopsy. So it's like a checkpoint.
Yeah, a way to see how things are going
Right.
and whether they need to change the game plan.
Okay, so we've talked about how treatment's monitored and adjusted for high-risk patients. What about people who aren't on immunosuppressive therapy, those managing with just supportive care?
They need regular monitoring too, absolutely.
Okay.
Remember, IgAN can be sneaky. It can progress, even if someone's feeling fine.
So no resting on your laurels just because you're not feeling any symptoms.
Exactly.
What are doctors looking for when they monitor folks on supportive care?
They're especially watching out for any big jumps in proteinuria.
Right.
If it goes up by more than 50% and gets over 1 gram per day, that's a red flag.
And what about kidney function? Any warning signs there?
Yeah, if those creatinine levels start to rise or the eGFR starts going down more than it should just from taking an ACE inhibitor or ARB, that's a sign something might be off.
So any major changes in those lab results mean they need to investigate further.
Absolutely.
And they might even do another biopsy, right?
You might, yeah.
Just to see what's going on and figure out if they need to step up the treatment.
Exactly.
Okay, so monitoring and adjusting treatment for IgAN, it's a pretty dynamic process.
It is.
It's a constant back and forth between the doctor and the patient,
Right.
looking at those lab results, figuring out what's going on with symptoms,
Yeah.
and tweaking the plan as needed.
It's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
It's definitely not. It really requires teamwork between the doctor and the patient.
It does.
Open communication,
Right.
regular checkups,
Uh-huh.
and a willingness to change the treatment plan if things aren't working.
That's so important.
And I imagine that can be tough for both sides,
It can.
the doctor and the patient. It's a lot to juggle.
It is. But at the end of the day,
Right.
the goal is to keep those kidneys working and prevent complications down the road.
Right.
And by being vigilant, by monitoring closely and making adjustments as needed, we can often achieve that goal.
That's good to hear. Now, we've talked a lot about the medical side of IgAN, but I'm really curious about the patient perspective.
Oh, yeah.
What's it actually like to live with this disease?
That's a really important question.
What are their day-to-day lives like?
It's something that often gets overlooked, you know?
Living with a chronic illness like IgAN is about so much more than just medications and blood tests.
It is. It's about the emotional toll, the lifestyle changes,
Yeah.
the uncertainty.
All those things that don't really show up in research papers.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And that's why it's crucial for doctors to really see the whole person, not just the disease.
Right. To understand their unique challenges and support them through this journey, it's about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
Exactly. Speaking of the whole person, we haven't really talked about what happens when these treatments don't work,
Right.
when IgAN progresses no matter what we do.
That's a tough topic, but an important one.
It is, because unfortunately, sometimes IgAN does progress to end-stage kidney disease,
End-stage kidney disease, yeah.
even with the best medical care.
So what happens then?
Well, that's when kidney replacement therapy comes into play.
Kidney replacement therapy.
There are two main options,
What are
dialysis and transplantation.
dialysis and transplantation? Okay.
Right.
Those are both pretty major life changes.
They are, but they can also be life-saving. They allow people with end-stage kidney disease to live longer, healthier lives.
So there is hope.
There is, absolutely. We'll dive deeper into those options a bit later.
Okay.
But for now, let's shift back to those earlier stages of IgAN,
Okay.
when we still have a lot of tools to protect those kidneys.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to get back to the treatment options.
Great, because there's so much more to discuss.
What's next?
Well, we've talked about supportive care and immunosuppressive therapy,
Yeah.
but there are also some other interesting therapies for IgAN. Things that aren't necessarily the main treatment,
Okay.
but they can still be helpful.
Interesting. What are those?
We call them adjunctive therapies.
Adjunctive therapies. All right. I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
One you might have heard of is tonsillectomy.
Tonsillectomy. Wait, like getting your tonsils removed?
Yeah.
What does that have to do with kidneys?
No, it sounds strange.
It does.
But there's a theory that the tonsils might play a role in how IgAN develops.
Really? How so?
Well, remember those abnormal IgA antibodies we talked about? The ones that get stuck in the kidneys and cause all that inflammation?
Yeah, those troublemakers.
Right. Well, some researchers think that the tonsils might be producing some of those abnormal antibodies.
Oh, so by removing the tonsils, you're basically cutting off the source of those bad antibodies.
That's the idea.
That's pretty clever.
It is, but the evidence on tonsillectomy for IgAN is kind of a mixed bag.
Really?
Yeah, some studies have shown some good results,
Right.
but others haven't.
So is it a common treatment for IgAN?
Not really. Not in most countries, although it is more common in some Asian countries, like Japan.
Huh. I wonder if there's something about the genetics of IgAN that makes tonsillectomy work better in certain populations.
It's possible.
Interesting.
But we need more research to really understand why the results are so different.
Okay, so tonsillectomy is an option, but not necessarily a go-to treatment. What other adjunctive therapies have been studied?
There are a few others.
Okay.
Fish oil supplements,
Oh.
low antigen diets,
Right.
even intravenous immunoglobulin therapy.
Wow, quite a variety. So do any of those have good evidence to support their use?
Not really.
Okay.
Most of the studies have been small and the results haven't been super convincing.
Okay.
So these adjunctive therapies are usually seen as something to add on to the main treatments, not to replace them.
So people with IgAN should talk to their doctors to make sure they're not relying solely on these adjunctive therapies.
Right. They need to be getting that supportive or immunosuppressive care too.
Exactly. It's always best to have a well-rounded approach to treatment and stay up to date on the latest research.
I agree.
Speaking of research, I know the field of IgAN is constantly moving forward. What are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing?
That's what I love about this deep dive. There's
Yeah.
always something new happening.
Right.
And in the world of IgAN, there are some really promising areas of research that could lead to even better treatments in the future.
Okay, spill the beans. What are these groundbreaking new treatments?
Well, one area that's really hot right now is targeted therapies.
Targeted therapies.
These are medications designed to specifically block certain pathways that are involved in IgAN,
Okay.
but without affecting the rest of the immune system.
So it's like a more precise approach to immunosuppression.
Exactly. And that could mean fewer side effects.
That would be great. What pathways are they targeting?
One that looks really promising is a molecule called APRIL.
April, like the month.
It stands for a proliferation-inducing ligand.
A proliferation-inducing ligand. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is a bit of a tongue twister.
Okay, so what does April do?
APRIL plays a big role in making those abnormal IgA antibodies we keep talking about.
Ah, so by blocking April, you're stopping those harmful antibodies from being produced in the first place.
You got it. And there are already several APRIL inhibitors in clinical trials.
Clinical trials, huh? So they're actually being tested in people.
Yeah, they are. And some of the early results are pretty encouraging.
So those are definitely ones to watch.
They are. Another area of active research is complement inhibitors.
Complement inhibitors. What's complement?
Complement is part of the immune system, a system of proteins that helps fight off infections.
Okay, so how does that relate to IgAN?
Well, it turns out that the complement system can also be involved in the inflammation and damage that happens in IgAN.
Oh, so it's like a double-edged sword. Helpful for fighting infections, but also bad for the kidneys. So that's where the complement inhibitors come in.
Yep. Researchers are testing them to see if they can specifically target that complement pathway and reduce inflammation in the kidneys.
Okay, so another example of a more targeted approach, hopefully with fewer side effects.
That's the hope.
It sounds like it's a pretty exciting time for IgAN research with all these new therapies being developed.
It is.
Who knows what the future holds?
That's the beauty of science, right? Always pushing the boundaries.
I love it. So speaking of the future, let's talk about prognosis. What's the long-term outlook for people with IgAN?
That's a tough one to answer because the prognosis for IgAN is all over the map.
Really? Why is that?
It depends on a bunch of different factors.
Like what? Those things we talked about earlier. Proteinuria, hypertension, kidney function at diagnosis.
Exactly.
Anything else?
How well someone responds to treatment, their overall health, even their genes can play a role.
So it's a very personalized prognosis.
Very much so.
But one thing we do know for sure,
Yeah,
early diagnosis and treatment make a huge difference in the long run.
absolutely. Early detection is key.
So if someone's listening to this and they're worried about IgAN, the best thing they can do is talk to their doctor.
Absolutely.
The sooner it's diagnosed and treated, the better the chances of saving those kidneys and avoiding complications.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And even if IgAN does progress, there are still treatment options like dialysis and transplantation.
Right.
We'll talk about those in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. What else is on the agenda for part 3?
Well, so far we've mainly been talking about primary IgAN.
Right.
But there's also something called secondary IgAN.
Secondary IgAN, what's that?
It's basically IgAN that's caused by another underlying condition.
So it's like IgAN is a symptom, not the main problem.
You got it. It's like a medical mystery. We have to find the real culprit that's causing the IgAN.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
Intrigued.
Yeah.
Ugh.
What kind of conditions can cause this secondary IgAN?
All sorts of things. Things like liver disease,
Okay.
inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, even HIV infection.
So it's not just limited to problems with the kidneys.
Nope, IgAN can be a sign of a whole bunch of different health issues.
So I imagine treating secondary IgAN is kind of a two-pronged approach.
It is.
You have to address both the IgAN and whatever's causing it.
Exactly. So first, you address the underlying condition.
Okay, treat the root cause. What's the second part?
At the same time, you manage the IgAN itself using the same strategies we talked about earlier.
Right, the supportive care, blood pressure control, and immunosuppressive therapy if needed.
Exactly. It's a bit like fighting a battle on two fronts.
So do we know if treating that root cause actually helps the IgAN?
There's actually some promising research that shows it does.
Oh, really? Give me an example.
Well, for instance, in celiac disease, if someone strictly follows a gluten-free diet, it can actually improve their kidney function.
Wow.
And sometimes those IgA deposits in the kidneys even disappear.
So sometimes treating the cause can really turn things around.
It can. And there's similar evidence with inflammatory bowel disease.
Oh.
Getting that inflammation in the gut under control seemed to have good effects on the kidneys too.
It really shows how connected everything is in the body.
It does.
Well, that brings us to what's probably the toughest part of our conversation today. What happens when IgAN progresses no matter what we try? What happens when someone gets end-stage kidney disease?
That's a tough one.
It is.
That's when we have to start talking about kidney replacement therapy.
Okay, kidney replacement therapy.
There are two main options: dialysis and transplantation.
All right, let's break those down. First up, dialysis. What is it exactly?
Dialysis is a life-saving treatment.
Okay.
It basically takes over for the kidneys when they can't do their job anymore.
So it filters the blood and gets rid of waste products just like healthy kidneys do.
Exactly. It's like an artificial kidney.
Interesting.
And there are two main types of dialysis:
Okay, what are they?
hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis.
Hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. What's the difference?
Hemodialysis filters the blood outside the body using a machine.
Okay.
The patient's connected to the machine through a special access point, usually in their arm.
And how often do they have to do that?
Usually 3 times a week
3 times a week.
for several hours each time.
So it's a pretty big commitment. What about peritoneal dialysis?
Peritoneal dialysis uses the lining of the abdomen, called the peritoneum, as a filter.
Okay.
They put a special fluid into the abdomen, and it pulls the waste products out of the blood.
I see.
Then they drain the fluid and get rid of it.
So it's like using the body's own lining as a filter?
Exactly. And the great thing about peritoneal dialysis
Yeah.
is that people can do it at home,
At home, that's great.
usually at night while they're sleeping.
So more flexibility, less disruption to everyday life.
Right. But both types of dialysis have their pluses and minuses.
Okay.
The best choice really depends on the individual person.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. It depends on their health, their lifestyle, all sorts of things.
Okay, so dialysis is one option for folks with end-stage kidney disease. You mentioned transplantation, too.
Transplantation, yeah.
What does that involve?
That involves taking out the damaged kidney
Okay.
and replacing it with a healthy kidney from a donor.
A donor kidney. Where do they get those from?
They can come from deceased donors or living donors.
Wait, so someone can actually donate a kidney while they're still alive?
They can. And you can live a totally healthy life with just one kidney.
Wow.
It's really an incredible gift that can totally change someone's life.
That's amazing. So how does transplantation stack up against dialysis?
Well, transplantation can offer a more normal life.
Yeah.
You're not tied to those dialysis treatments.
Right.
But it's important to remember it's major surgery.
Of course.
There are definitely risks.
What are some of the risks?
There's always a chance that the body might reject the new kidney.
Oh, right.
And transplant patients have to take immunosuppressant meds for the rest of their lives to prevent that from happening.
Okay.
So there's a lot to think about.
Definitely a big decision.
Yeah, it's a life-changing choice.
Right.
And it's not one to be made lightly.
So you really have to talk to your doctor, your loved ones,
Absolutely.
and really weigh all those factors.
It's a team effort.
Well, I think we've really gone deep on IgA nephropathy today. We've covered what it is, how it's diagnosed, all the different treatment options, the potential complications, even those new therapies that are in the works.
It's been a great discussion.
It has.
Really fascinating to explore all the ins and outs of this disease.
Yeah. And hopefully our listeners are feeling a lot more knowledgeable about IgAN, more comfortable talking to their doctors about it.
That's the goal.
But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one last thought.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the medical side of IgAN,
Right.
but what about the human side?
The human side.
What's it actually like to live with this condition every day?
That's a great point.
What are the challenges, the victories, the emotional ups and downs that come with an IgAN diagnosis? I really encourage you to seek out those personal stories, those lived experiences, because they offer a powerful perspective that often gets overlooked.
I love that.
Yeah.
Those personal stories can teach us so much. They remind us that behind every diagnosis is a real person going through their own unique journey.
Well said.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. So we've been exploring this fascinating world of IgA nephropathy.
Again.
We've covered everything from how it's diagnosed to how it's treated,
Right.
even some of those cutting-edge treatments on the horizon.
The future of IgAN treatment.
Exactly. But now we're going to dive into some of those more specific cases.
Say.
Remember those special situations we mentioned earlier?
I do.
Like secondary IgAN,
Secondary IgAN.
and those times when, even with the best care, kidney function declines.
Right. those tough cases.
Think of it like IgAN 202,
IgAN 202.
the advanced course.
The advanced course. I like that.
So let's start by unraveling this whole secondary IgAN thing. You mentioned it's basically IgAN that's triggered by something else going on in the body, right?
Exactly. It's like IgAN is a symptom,
Mhm.
not the actual disease itself.
It's like a medical mystery. You got to figure out what's really causing the IgAN.
I like the way you think. It's like a detective novel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what kind of conditions can lead to this secondary IgAN?
Well, there's actually quite a few. Liver diseases,
Okay.
like cirrhosis.
Cirrhosis, right?
Inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis.
Right.
Celiac disease.
Celiac disease. Okay.
Even infections like HIV can trigger it.
Wow. So it's not just kidney problems.
No,
It can
no.
be a whole range of health issues. So if someone gets diagnosed with IgAN,
Right.
they really need a good checkup.
They're a workup. Yep.
Make sure there's nothing else going on.
Absolutely. Doctors need to rule out those other potential causes to make sure they're giving the best treatment.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do they treat secondary IgAN? Is it different from primary IgAN?
It's a two-part approach, really. First, you tackle the underlying condition.
Okay, treat the root cause.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that might mean medications, lifestyle changes, surgery.
Right.
Could be a combination of all those things.
Okay, so treat the root cause. What's the second part?
At the same time, you manage the IgAN itself using those same strategies we talked about before.
Right, supportive care, blood pressure control, and if they need it, immunosuppressive therapy.
Yep, you got it. It's like
Mhm.
fighting on two fronts.
It does sound complex,
It can be.
but do we know if treating the root cause actually helps the IgAN get better?
We do. There's some encouraging evidence for that.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
For example, in celiac disease, if someone sticks to a gluten-free diet,
Right, gluten-free.
it can actually improve their kidney function.
Wow, that's amazing.
Sometimes those IgA deposits in the kidneys even go away completely.
So sometimes treating the root cause can really make a huge difference.
It can. And we see something similar with inflammatory bowel disease.
Oh, interesting.
Getting that inflammation under control in the gut seems to be good for the kidneys too.
It's a good reminder that everything's connected, you know?
Exactly. The body's a complex system.
It is. Well, I think that brings us to probably the most difficult part of this discussion. What happens when IgAN progresses no matter what we do?
Right.
What happens when someone develops end-stage kidney disease?
That's when we have to shift gears and start talking about kidney replacement therapy.
Kidney replacement therapy.
There are two main options,
Oh.
dialysis and transplantation.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with dialysis, what exactly is it?
Dialysis is a life-saving treatment.
Okay.
It essentially steps in and does the work of the kidneys when they can't do it themselves anymore.
So it filters the blood, gets rid of those waste products.
Exactly.
It's like healthy kidneys do.
It's like an artificial kidney.
That's amazing.
And there are two main types of dialysis, hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis.
Hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis.
Yep.
Okay, what's the difference?
Hemodialysis, that's where the blood is filtered outside the body using a machine.
Okay.
The patient's hooked up to the machine through a special access point, usually in their arm.
Okay, makes sense. And how often do people have to do that?
Usually 3 times a week
3 times a week.
for a few hours each time.
So it's a pretty big time commitment. What about peritoneal dialysis?
Peritoneal dialysis uses the lining of the abdomen, the peritoneum,
Peritoneum.
as a filter.
Okay.
They put a special fluid into the abdomen,
Right.
and that fluid pulls the waste products out of the blood,
Oh, interesting.
and then the fluid's drained out and discarded.
So it's like using your own body's lining to filter your blood?
You got it.
That's pretty amazing.
And the best part about peritoneal dialysis is that people can do it at home.
That's a huge plus.
Yeah. Usually they do it at night while they sleep.
So much more flexibility,
Right.
less disruption to daily life.
Exactly. But both types of dialysis have their pros and cons.
Right.
The best option for each person really depends on their own situation.
What's best for one person might not be best for another.
Exactly. Their health, their lifestyle, all those things factor in.
Okay, so dialysis is one option for people with end-stage kidney disease.
Right.
The other one you mentioned was transplantation.
Transplantation, right.
So what does that entail?
They surgically remove the damaged kidney
Okay.
and replace it with a healthy kidney from a donor.
A donor kidney. And where do those come from?
They can come from deceased donors
Okay.
or living donors.
Okay. Wait, you can donate a kidney while you're still alive?
You can.
Yeah.
And people live perfectly healthy lives with just one kidney.
Wow.
It's really an amazing act of generosity.
It is.
It can completely change someone's life.
So how does transplantation compare to dialysis? What are the benefits? What are the risks?
Well, with a transplant, there's the potential to have a more normal life. They're
Right.
not tied to those dialysis treatments anymore.
Right.
But it's a big surgery,
Right.
and it comes with its own risks.
Like what?
Well, there's always the risk of rejection. The body might not accept the new kidney.
Okay.
And people who get transplants have to take those immunosuppressant medications for the rest of their lives to prevent that from happening.
Right. Right.
So it's not a decision to be made lightly.
It's a huge
A
decision.
life-changing one, really.
Oh, definitely.
It needs to be carefully considered,
Absolutely.
with good guidance from a medical team
Right.
and open communication with family and loved ones.
So important. Well, I think we've done a pretty thorough job of exploring IgA nephropathy today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We talked about what it is, how it's diagnosed, all the different treatment options,
Right.
potential complications, even some of those exciting new treatments that are being researched.
The future of IgAN.
Exactly. Hopefully, our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of this condition.
That's what we hope for.
And they feel empowered to talk to their doctors about it.
And advocate for their own health.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into IgA nephropathy. Thanks for joining us. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay well.
See you next time. All right, so let's jump right in. Today we're going to kind of explore something pretty crucial when it comes to kidney transplantation.
Okay.
And that is the potential for IgA nephropathy, or IgAN, to recur,
Right.
even after you get a new kidney.
Yeah.
And we're working with an in-depth, up-to-date article on this, and I think you're going to find the insights pretty surprising.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. Transplantation offers a new beginning for a lot of those with kidney failure due to IgAN, but this possibility of it returning
Right.
in the transplanted kidney, that's a significant concern.
Yeah, so just to be clear for anyone just joining us, IgAN is this disease where this protein called IgA, it kind of
Yeah.
dunks up the kidney's filtering system,
Right.
and it can ultimately lead to kidney failure.
Yeah.
And so transplantation is often the lifeline in that situation. But then the question becomes,
Yeah.
what if the IgAN comes back? Like, what are we looking at in terms of recurrence rates here?
Yeah, so studies show that the cumulative incidence of recurrence can be as high as 23% at 15 years post-transplant.
Wow.
So that's nearly a quarter of recipients could face this issue years down the line.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and the median time to recurrence is about 3.5 years.
Okay, and then the article mentions this concept of silent recurrence.
Right.
What's that all about?
Silent recurrence means that, while the IgA deposits can be detected on a biopsy, they aren't causing noticeable symptoms or problems with kidney function,
Right.
at least not yet. So it's kind of like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah,
We know it's there, but we're not sure, when or if it will cause problems.
that's a little unsettling.
Yeah.
So what are some of the potential clues, researchers are looking at to understand why some folks experience this recurrence and others don't?
Well, one area of investigation has been donor type, so living-related versus deceased donors.
Okay.
Some studies suggest there's a slightly higher risk with living-related donors,
Really?
possibly due to shared genetic factors that increase susceptibility.
Huh. That's interesting, because I would have thought a kidney from a close relative would be a better fit.
Yeah.
But I guess when it comes to IgAN and genetics, it's not that simple.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of this disease, and it really underscores the need for, personalized approaches.
Right.
Beyond donor type, researchers are also digging into the role of HLA factors. These are the protein ID cards that we have on our cells that help the immune system distinguish self from non-self.
So are you saying there might be certain HLA types that make someone more prone to IgAN recurrence?
That's what the research is suggesting, yeah. Specific HLA alleles in the recipient, like HLA-B35 and HLA-DR4, have been linked to a higher risk of recurrence.
Okay.
Interestingly, the degree of HLA matching between the donor and recipient seems to matter as well.
Okay.
And while a good match is generally desirable to minimize the risk of rejection, in the context of IgAN, some studies indicate that it could actually increase the chances of the disease coming back.
Wow, so it complicates the matching process even more.
It does.
It's like walking a tightrope. What other factors are on the radar?
Another interesting piece of the puzzle is the timing of glucocorticoid withdrawal.
Okay.
So these are steroids that are commonly used to suppress the immune system after transplantation,
Right.
and they need to be managed carefully. Studies have shown that withdrawing them too early might elevate the risk of IgAN recurrence.
So it's not just about which medications you take, but also how you manage them over time.
Precisely. It emphasizes the importance of working closely with your healthcare team and adhering to the prescribed regimen.
This is getting pretty intricate. Are there any other risk factors we should know about, like work beyond donor type, HLA, and medication management?
Yeah, there are a number of other avenues being explored.
Okay.
For instance, researchers are looking into things like high serum IgA concentration,
Mm.
the presence of IgA1-specific IgG autoantibodies.
What are those?
These are unusual antibodies that seem to play a role in IgA, and even rare genetic variants in a gene called CFHR5, which is involved in regulating the complement system, a critical part of the immune response.
So lots of potential culprits, but no single smoking gun just yet.
Yeah, it's a multifactorial disease, meaning there's likely a combination of factors at play.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about prevention. Knowing all these risks, is there anything that can be done to stop recurrence from happening in the first place?
Unfortunately, there's no guaranteed way to prevent IgAN recurrence, and that's, a frustrating reality for both patients and physicians. However, research is ongoing with a lot of focus on refining immunosuppressive drug protocols.
Okay.
But so far, the evidence suggests that aside from avoiding that early glucocorticoid withdrawal, the specific drugs used may not make a dramatic difference in preventing recurrence.
So no magic bullet just yet. What about those powerful super suppressors, the induction agents, like antithymocyte globulin, that are sometimes used right before or after transplantation?
Yeah,
Do those have any impact?
the jury's still out on that one. The idea is to really dampen down that immune response early on to prevent rejection.
Right.
But the data on whether this strategy actually influences IgAN recurrence is inconclusive.
So more research is needed on that front.
Definitely.
What about early detection? Are there any signs or symptoms that could suggest a recurrence is happening, even if it's that silent type?
Yeah. One of the key things to watch for is persistent microscopic hematuria, meaning blood in the urine that you wouldn't even notice without a test.
Okay.
So regular urine tests are really vital after transplantation to catch this early.
So blood in the urine is a red flag.
Okay.
What else should folks be aware of?
Proteinuria, which is protein in the urine,
Okay.
and a rise in creatinine levels, which signals that the kidneys aren't filtering waste products effectively. Those are also potential warning signs.
Okay.
It's crucial to monitor these closely. And interestingly, the course of IgAN in the native kidneys can offer clues as well. If a patient experienced rapid progression of the disease before transplantation, they might be more likely to have an early recurrence in the new kidney.
So it's almost like the disease has a memory, unfortunately.
Right.
But how do you actually confirm the diagnosis?
The gold standard is a kidney biopsy.
Okay.
And while it's an invasive procedure, it provides a definitive answer about the presence of those IgA deposits in the transplanted kidney.
Right.
The decision to biopsy is made carefully taking into account creatinine levels, the degree of proteinuria, and the overall clinical picture.
So it's a balancing act between getting a definitive diagnosis and minimizing risk for the patient. Now, let's say the biopsy confirms IgAN recurrence. What happens then? What are the treatment options?
Well, the good news is we have a range of therapies that can help manage the recurrence. Almost universally, patients are started on ACE inhibitors, or ARBs.
Yeah.
These are medications that are primarily used to lower blood pressure. But here's the fascinating part. These meds also have protective effects on the kidneys by reducing protein leakage and slowing down that scarring process,
Okay.
making them a cornerstone of treatment.
So they're multitasking medications.
Exactly.
Okay.
And often they're used even if there's no evidence of recurrence, especially if the patient has hypertension as a preventative measure to protect that transplanted kidney.
That's a proactive approach. But what about more severe cases? What if those medications aren't enough?
For those situations, we might turn to high-dose glucocorticoids, which are steroids. These are potent anti-inflammatory drugs that can tamp down the immune response and slow disease progression.
Right.
But they do come with potential side effects, so the goal is to use the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible time.
So a careful balancing act is needed there. What about other options if steroids don't do the trick?
If a patient isn't responding well to steroids, cyclophosphamide, a type of chemotherapy drug, might be considered. It's a more aggressive treatment, but it can be effective in some cases. Okay.
And there are also newer options being explored, like targeted release butanide, a type of steroid that's delivered directly to the gut.
Why the gut? I thought we were talking about kidneys.
Yeah, it's a fascinating new frontier in IgAN research. There's growing evidence that the gut microbiome, the community of bacteria living in our intestines, may play a role in the development and progression of IgAN.
Wow.
So this targeted release butanide aims to modulate the immune response in the gut, which could have downstream effects on the kidneys.
So we're talking about a potential link between gut health and kidney health.
Yeah.
This is getting complex.
It is. It's a complex web of interactions, but unraveling those connections is where the real breakthroughs lie.
Okay.
And speaking of complexity, we need to discuss the long-term outlook for patients with recurrent IgAN.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. Historically, I thought graft survival was pretty similar for IgAN patients compared to those without it. Is that still the case? Unfortunately, new data paints a more nuanced picture. While early graft survival rates might be similar, the risk of losing that transplanted kidney increases over time for those with IgAN recurrence.
Okay.
One study found that the median time from recurrence diagnosis to graft loss was only about 3 years.
It's a sobering statistic.
It is. And the prognosis is even worse if recurrent IgAN is coupled with chronic rejection, another potential complication after transplantation.
So a double whammy. But didn't the article mention something about second transplants?
Yes, that's an important point. Even if a patient loses their first transplanted kidney to IgAN recurrence, it's not necessarily the end of the road.
Okay.
Some individuals have done well with a second transplant.
So there's still hope, even in those challenging situations.
Yes, absolutely. The human body is remarkably resilient, and advances in transplant medicine are constantly expanding the possibilities.
Well, this has been quite an eye-opener so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the risk factors and warning signs to the diagnostic process and treatment options.
Yeah, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to delve into, from the Oxford classification of IgAN, which helps predict outcomes,
Okay.
to the intriguing connection between IgAN and another condition called IgA vasculitis.
Oh, let's unpack that a bit. What is this Oxford classification, and how does IgA vasculitis fit into all of this?
Yeah.
I think we need to go a little deeper.
So the Oxford classification is a system that pathologists use to kind of evaluate the severity of IgAN from kidney biopsies.
Okay.
And it looks at 5 key features under the microscope:
Okay.
mesangial hypercellularity, endocapillary hypercellularity, segmental glomerulosclerosis, tubular atrophy interstitial fibrosis, and crescent.
Okay, those are some serious medical terms.
Yeah.
Break it down for me. What are those features actually telling us about the kidney?
So essentially, they reflect different types and degrees of damage.
Okay.
So for instance, mesangial hypercellularity means there's an overabundance of cells crammed into the mesangium,
But
which is a kind of support structure within the kidney's filtering units. You can imagine it like overcrowding in tiny apartments.
I get the picture.
Oh.
And what about endocapillary hypercellularity?
So that indicates inflammation and too many cells within the capillaries,
Right.
the tiny blood vessels that are responsible for filtration.
Mm-hmm.
It's like having traffic jams in the kidney's filtration highway.
Okay, all right. Then there's segmental glomerulosclerosis.
Right, so that points to scarring in portions of the glomerulus, the kidney's main filtering unit.
Okay.
Think of it as potholes on that highway disrupting the smooth flow.
Okay. So far, so good.
Mm.
What about those last two, tubular atrophied interstitial fibrosis and crescents?
All right, so tubular atrophy and interstitial fibrosis signal damage and scarring in the tubules,
Oh.
those tiny tubes that carry filtered waste out of the kidney, and the interstitium, which is the connective tissue surrounding them.
Okay.
It's like wear and tear on the kidney's plumbing system.
Gotcha. And lastly, crescents.
Crescents are formations that develop in the glomeruli,
Okay.
and they signify severe inflammation and damage.
Wow, it's amazing how much information can be gleaned from such a tiny sample of kidney tissue.
It really is. And the fascinating part is that these features, when scored using the Oxford classification, can actually help predict how the disease might progress.
Oh, wow.
So studies have shown that higher Oxford scores are associated with a worse prognosis,
Okay.
meaning a higher risk of kidney function decline and even graft loss.
So it's a valuable tool for understanding the severity of the disease and guiding treatment decisions.
Precisely. It allows clinicians to really tailor those treatment plans based on individual risk profiles.
Now, you mentioned IgA vasculitis earlier.
Yeah.
How does that relate to IgAN?
So IgA vasculitis, also known as Henoch-Schönlein purpura, is an autoimmune disease that causes inflammation and bleeding in small blood vessels throughout the body.
Okay.
It primarily affects children, but it can occur in adults as well. Like IgAN, it can involve the kidneys,
Okay.
causing a type of kidney inflammation called IgA vasculitis nephritis.
So they both involve IgA and can affect the kidneys, but they're not the same thing.
Exactly. While the kidney manifestations can appear very similar under the microscope, the
Right.
underlying causes are distinct.
Okay.
IgAN is thought to arise from a combination of genetic and environmental factors,
Right.
leading to this abnormal production and deposition of IgA in the kidneys.
Hmm.
IgA vasculitis, on the other hand, is often triggered by an infection or some other environmental factor that sets off a misdirected immune response,
Okay.
attacking small blood vessels, including those in the kidneys.
Interesting. So one is more of a chronic smoldering process, and the other is more of an acute inflammatory reaction.
That's a good way to put it. And unfortunately, like IgA vasculitis can also recur after a kidney transplantation.
Oh, no.
Yeah, studies show recurrence rates of around 15% at 5 years post-transplant.
So another challenge for transplant recipients. Does recurrence of IgA vasculitis also raise the risk of graft loss?
Yes, it can lead to kidney damage and potentially graft loss similar to IgAN recurrence.
Okay.
The good news is that the treatment approaches are similar for both conditions.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear.
Mm.
Are those treatments also centered around ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and steroids?
Exactly. ACE inhibitors or ARBs are typically that first line of defense, followed by steroids or other immunosuppressive drugs if necessary.
It's fascinating how seemingly different conditions can share similar pathways and treatment strategies.
It highlights the interconnectedness of, various disease processes and the power of medical research to find commonalities and translate discoveries into clinical practice.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful so far. We've explored the complexities of IgAN recurrence, the Oxford classification, and even delved into IgA vasculitis.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Really?
There's still so much to unpack, from the nuanced challenges of managing immunosuppression to the intriguing possibility of IgA deposits being found in donated kidneys.
Hold on, IgA deposits in donated kidneys.
Yeah.
You mean even kidneys from healthy donors can harbor these deposits? Tell me more about that.
It is a fascinating and somewhat perplexing phenomenon. Research has shown that IgA deposits can be present in kidneys from donors who didn't have any evidence of kidney disease.
Really?
Yeah, they're essentially silent passengers, and in most cases, they don't seem to cause any problems.
So they're like benign bystanders.
Yeah.
But what happens if a kidney with these incidental IgA deposits is transplanted into a recipient who doesn't have IgAN?
You're right.
Could that trigger the disease in the recipient?
That's the million-dollar question researchers are grappling with.
Yeah.
The evidence is still somewhat inconclusive. Some studies suggest that transplanting a kidney with IgA deposits might increase the risk of the recipient developing IgAN, but the data is limited.
So it's a potential risk, but the extent of that risk is still unclear.
Exactly. It's a gray area where we need more research to provide definitive answers.
Okay.
And because of this uncertainty, some transplant centers are hesitant to use kidneys with known IgA deposits for donation.
It makes sense to err on the side of caution, especially when we're talking about such a complex procedure with potentially lifelong implications. What does all of this tell us about the bigger picture of IgAN and transplantation?
It underscores the critical importance of careful donor selection, thorough evaluation of potential recipients, and close monitoring after transplantation.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act, weighing the risks and benefits and making individualized decisions based on each patient's unique circumstances.
And precisely. And with so much at stake, it's a process that requires a collaborative approach involving a team of healthcare professionals working together to ensure the best possible outcomes for transplant recipients.
This deep dive has really shed light on the intricate web of factors involved in IgAN recurrence after kidney transplantation. It's a complex journey filled with challenges, but also hope.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. There's still many unanswered questions and avenues for further exploration.
Speaking of unanswered questions, are there any particular areas of research that are particularly exciting right now? Where do we go from here?
Oh, there are so many. It's a really exciting time to be involved in this research. I think one area that's really heating up is the investigation of genetic factors.
Okay.
We've pinpointed some potential culprits like those HLA types we talked about,
Right.
but there's still a vast landscape of genes and their interactions to explore.
It's like trying to solve a giant genetic jigsaw puzzle, right?
Exactly. Each piece we uncover brings us closer to understanding the bigger picture.
Yeah, and as we uncover more pieces, we might be able to develop more personalized approaches to prevention and treatment,
Right.
tailoring strategies to an individual's genetic makeup.
Exactly.
That'd be a huge step forward, moving from a one-size-fits-all approach to something much more precise.
Absolutely.
Are there other promising research avenues on the horizon?
Another area that holds immense potential is the development of biomarkers for IgAN recurrence. So
Yeah.
imagine if we could identify a measurable substance in the body,
Right.
maybe a specific protein or antibody that could signal a high risk of recurrence even before it happens.
That would be incredible, like having a crystal ball. You
Exactly.
could potentially adjust immunosuppressive regimens or explore preventative measures before the disease even has a chance to take hold.
Precisely. It would revolutionize how we manage IgAN in the context of transplantation.
Oh,
There's also a lot of interest in understanding the long-term effects of recurrent IgAN,
mm.
particularly its impact on quality of life and overall health.
So beyond just graft survival, right?
Yeah.
What are the broader consequences for patients?
Exactly. Researchers are looking at factors like cardiovascular health, bone density, and even mental well-being to paint a more comprehensive picture of how recurrent IgAN affects patients' lives.
So it's important to consider those aspects as well, not just focusing on the kidneys in isolation.
Right. It's about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
This deep dive has been incredibly enlightening. We've uncovered so much about IgAN recurrence, the risks, the challenges, the ongoing research. And it feels like we're just at the tip of the iceberg.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to learn. And that's the beauty of science. It's a constant process of discovery, driven by curiosity and a desire to improve people's lives.
Speaking of discovery,
Hmm.
is there anything about IgAN recurrence that still keeps you up at night? Any big unanswered questions that are particularly perplexing or frustrating?
One of the biggest mysteries that continues to intrigue me is the role of the complement system.
Hold on.
We touched on it briefly when discussing that CFHR5 gene,
Right.
but this intricate network of proteins plays a crucial role in the immune response, and we're still unraveling how it contributes to, again, development and progression.
So there's like a complex interplay between the complement system, the abnormal IgA deposits, and the inflammatory process that damages the kidneys.
It's a tangled web, and we're just beginning to untangle the threads.
Right.
Understanding how the complement system goes awry in IgAN could lead to entirely new therapeutic targets, potentially even ways to prevent recurrence altogether.
That would be a game changer. It's exciting to think about the possibilities that lie ahead.
It is. With each new discovery, we move closer to a future where kidney transplantation can offer a truly lasting solution for patients with IgAN.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey into the world of IgAN recurrence. We've learned about the intricacies of the disease, the challenges it poses for transplantation, and the incredible research underway to uncover its secrets and develop better treatments.
It's been a pleasure exploring this complex topic with you, and I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of this important issue and a sense of hope for the future.
I'm sure they have. It's clear that even with all the complexities and unknowns, there's a passionate community of researchers and clinicians dedicated to improving the lives of those affected by IgAN.
That dedication is what drives progress. And as we continue to learn and collaborate, the future for IgAN patients is looking brighter than ever.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into IgAN recurrence after kidney transplantation. It's been a truly insightful conversation, and we look forward to bringing you more fascinating explorations into the world of science and medicine.